attendees an overview. Here we are, and there you can see we're actually going to be recording this session today, so that if anybody wants to watch this on catch up, you can. We'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation from Gosha. So if you do have any questions, you can put those into the Q&A box on the very bottom of the screen. And with that, I'm going to pass on over to Gosha now to kick off the session.
So thanks, Helen, a lot for the introduction. So I would like to also welcome everyone who has decided to join this webinar. So as Helen mentioned, the topic is basically transparency and consent framework, to shortly explain how it works and what is the goal of the TCF. So may I please get the next slide? Thanks. So the agenda for today is as follows. So the first one is basically, in a nutshell, explain what is the transparency and consent framework. Later on, a bit more how it functions. Later, I will talk a bit about the development and adaptation, also how to register, the compliance programs, and the TCF resources. The last slide is basically a summary of the most important resources that you can use in order to find out more. And as Helen mentioned, at the very end, there is the time for questions. So feel free to put them in the Q&A box. And just saying, if you have a bit more, let's say, a complex question, maybe it will be even easier to send me the email afterwards. So also later, I will put my email in the chat so that you can ask it, because sometimes the questions are really particular, or let's say really depends on the case. So it would be much easier, for example, to come back to me in writing in this case, but let's just see. So yeah, okay, may I get the next slide? Yeah. So in the first place, I will try to explain what is the transparency and consent framework. So may I? Yeah, thank you. So in a nutshell, TCF is a voluntary and open source standard that was launched in April 2018 and is targeted to the three different groups of stakeholders for CMPs, vendors, and publishers. And it was actually the aftermath of the upcoming GDPR, because GDPR has been in force since May 2018. And the sector was trying to find a solution that, on one hand, would facilitate the compliance for the stakeholders with some of the EU privacy and data protection regulations, but on the other hand, also improve transparency and control to the individuals over their personal data. So let's say TCF is not only for the stakeholders, but also the goal here was to find a solution that also helps the users, the end users, to understand what is actually happening when they express their consent. And in short, how to explain how it works. So let's say the TCF facilitate the compliance with some of the EU regulations, but also helps to obtain e-privacy consent and establishing the GDPR legal basis by informing the end users about the vendors that are active on certain websites, what type of data processing activities they do, and also for under which legal basis, so that, let's say, TCF helps especially the vendors that don't have the direct access to the end users and need publishers as the intermediaries. So in order to reach the end users that way, and helps to establish the consent and legal basis. May I get the next slide, please? So now a bit how it functions. So let's say TCF is not only TCF policies, but as well as the technical specifications. So both of these documents are really important for the TCF participants, because policies can be called as a set of rules that each TCF participant need to follow, whereas the technical specifications are more like how to implement the TCF from the technical point of view. And both of them are kind of guidelines for the TCF participants to how actually implement and follow the rules of TCF properly. And also here, I will explain it more in detail in a moment, but TCF is said to be based on 3 pillars of standardization, because the main goal of the TCF is also to standardize in order to make sure that the the information to the end user is provided in a standardized way, and also in order to improve and make easier for the TCF participants to communicate with each other. So the first pillar is basically the standardization of the user, the first pillar is the standardization of the information that should be displayed to the end user in the TCF CMP banner. The second pillar is how user choices should be recorded in the form of TC string. And the third pillar is how in the standardization of the communication between the TCF participants. And especially the third pillar is based on the technical specification that include a technical protocol that enable parties to communicate the status of disclosures provided and data subject privacy preferences in real time. So these three pillars are basically standardized something. Okay, may I get the next slide? Also, the really important part of the TCF are the purposes. So TCF itself doesn't prescribe which TCF purposes the participants have to declare. It creates just the classification of the most common purposes that are first by the different parties within the digital space. So under each purpose, there are several different processing activities that each purpose encompasses. So then a vendor, when it registers, can check the description of the purpose and assess whether its activity is actually encompassed in this purpose or not, so that later on when it registers can decide which purpose it should declare. And also, as you may see, some of the purposes are not exactly related to advertising. I would say half of the purposes are actually not strictly advertising related. And we have more and more vendors that are not only active in the advertising space or not are active there at all. So, for example, the TCF doesn't have to be used only in the advertising, but we have vendors that provide, for example, the processing activities related to content or audience measurement. So, yeah, and also, as I said, framework doesn't indicate which purposes have to be declared. It's up to the vendor to decide based on the vendor guidelines that are included in the TCF policies. And then after reading, the vendor can assess which purposes are relevant for them and declare them. So it's again more like standard classification of the most common purposes in order to later on standardize the CMP UI and the communication between the TCF participants. May I get the next slide? So here we have the first pillar of the TCF, which is the standardization of information and choices about vendors. So at the very beginning, when vendors register, they need to declare the purposes they are going to use within the framework and also under which legal basis. But it's not everything. They need to provide also the information regarding, for example, the data retention periods or the categories of data they use. So later on, this information that is provided at the registration level later on is disclosed in the global vendor list, which is basically a publicly available register, which can be used later on by the CMPs and publisher to decide, for example, from the publisher's point of view, to decide with which vendor they want to work with, because not each of them might be relevant in their case. And also this information is really important for the CMPs because they need to disclose certain information in the CMP UI in the vendor's descriptions. So let's say here is the standardization, what type of information should be included in the CMP UI. So TCF policies basically indicate the minimum requirements on what should be included in the CMP UI so that the end user can have the standardized information about each vendor that belongs to the TCF and can take the decision regarding each vendor and each purpose it pairs. May I get the next slide? So here we have the standardized of how user choices should be captured and recorded. So later, when the user express its consent, the TC string is created, and TC string is a binary format string that encompasses basically to what user agreed or not agreed to, and it contains from 0 and 1s. So 0 means that the user didn't agree to certain version or certain purpose. 1 means that the user agreed. So also in technical specifications, there is described exactly what means each field in the TC string, so that each TCF participant can read and understand the choices that was given by the end user. So let's say the format of this TC string is also standardized. So it's the second pillar. May I get the next slide? Thank you. The third pillar is basically the standardization of the communication between the TCF participants. So when the TC string is created, the TCF participants using the standard protocol that is prescribed in the technical specifications know how to read the TC string, and also whether they can transfer it further to the other downstream partners. So here on this graphic, you can see that TC string was created, and then it contains several information regarding vendors and whether the user gave consent to which of them and to which purposes. So for example, here you can see that the vendor 1 got the consent for the purpose 1, but not for purpose 2. And in case of vendor 2, it was agreed by the user to process its data for purpose 1 and 3, but vendor number 3 didn't get consent at all. So the vendor number 2 knows that it can transfer further the signal to vendor 3 because the end user didn't agree to that. So in this case, the communication is standardized for the technical specification. So each TCF participant, if follow the technical specification, should understand and know what it can do with the signal that was created by the end user. And also TCF can be used both in the web as well as app environment, and also with connected TV. And also there is the special field in the TC string for OpenRTB protocol, so it can be used that way. May I get the next slide? So here a bit about development and adaptation of the TCF. So basically, TCF is constantly developing by the working groups with the support of the IAB Europe staff. Okay, Helen, can I get next slide? Thanks. So let's say we are constantly working on improving the framework to make sure that it replies to the needs of the market, and also we monitor the changes of the legislation to make sure that the framework can, as much as it's possible, facilitate the compliance. So also, when it comes to decision, it's up to the participants of our working groups, and the way that is used to vote is weighted voting, which means that each stakeholder group can really have the impact on the decision that we are actually doing. And there have been some iterations already. The newest one is TCF version 2.2, that the implementation timeline was 20th of November this year, so not so long time ago. So right now, the most current version of the TCF is version 2.2. So everyone who would like to register needs to fulfill the criteria indicated in this version of the TCF policies. And currently, we have more than 90% of publishers that's selling ads and they adopted TCF. We have more than 850 vendors and more than 150 CMPs. And when it comes to CMPs, we have both in the web, app, and connected TV environment. And vendors, as I mentioned earlier, we don't only have the vendors that are active in the advertising sector, but also that are not really related to this sector. May I get the next slide? Okay, so right now a bit how to register. So basically, publishers don't have to register, but they still need to follow the TCF policies that are relevant for them. It's chapter 4. When it comes to the vendors and CMPs, they need to pay the annual fee and provide some extra information at the registration level. So vendors needs to declare certain information that are going to be disclosed later in the global vendor list, and also submit the vendor compliance form. That is basically, we ask vendors to see if they really understand the policies and the rules of the framework. And in the case of the CMPs, we also check the CMPY if it fulfills the minimum standard requirements prescribed in the policies. So before the CMP is actually accepted within the framework, there is the validation process. And in here you have two emails that might be useful afterwards. Two of them are actually really useful at the very beginning of the implementation of the TCF. So if you would have questions regarding the registration, the framework one is the most proper one. TCF compliance email is more is really useful when it comes to the validation process of the CMPs, but also if there are kind of problems or questions regarding how to implement the TCF. The framework one is more how to register. May I get the next slide? Okay, so right now the compliance programs. So in order to make sure that the TCF integrity is still ongoing, and also to make sure that the TCF participants still comply with their commitments, IAB Europe introduced the compliance programs that verify if there is the compliance with the policies and technical specifications. So there is also on our website the catalog, the control catalog that indicate which elements of the live installations are susceptible to be audited, and also the relevant enforcement procedures in case of a breach. So the enforcement process depends on the type of the breach that a CMP or a vendor has made. And in the worst case scenario, a vendor or CMP can be suspended from the framework. But in the first place, when we see that something is wrong, we send the heads up, and there is the dialogue between IAB Europe and certain vendor or CMP. We also send, before we suspend someone, we send also the suspension warning or the notification, and and it's not really happening straight away. We really try to talk with the TCF participants and help them, because sometimes the problems are just on the implementation level, not really not because someone is doing something in a bad faith. So yeah, and also what is worth to mention, in case the breach is related to the TC string tampering, then it is also publicly notified by IAB Europe of this non-compliance situation, because it's really something that can harm the TCF integrity. But it really happens really rarely. I think maybe it was just one situation like that, or not at all. I'm not really sure, but I think if it was quite a long time ago. Right now, I would say we haven't noticed any, recently we haven't noticed any bad actors, which is good. Okay, may I get the next slide? So here, okay, the next slide, the TCF resources. So here is the list of the most useful TCF documents. So as you see, there are TCF policies, TCF terms and conditions, TCF technical specifications. So these documents are the most basic one that explain actually what the framework is and what are the rules. later on the global vendor list that contains the information about vendors. And TCF translations might be useful for you to see the TCF purposes in your mother languages. And the last link is also super useful because it's the link to our website where we have all the relevant TCF supporting resources displayed so that you have everything in one place if you would like to find out more. And that's all. That was my last slide. Thank you. And if you have any questions that I can try to answer them.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Gosha. Gosha, if you can just put your email address in the chat box, I think that'd be super helpful just for everyone that's registered. We will be sharing today's presentation. We'll send you a copy of the recording, and we'll also be sharing this presentation with you so that you can access all of those links. And in the meantime, as Gosha said, if there are any specific questions, you can either email Gosha. We also have a dedicated email, tcfcommunication@iabeurope.eu, so that you can contact us that way. But thank you very much for dialing in and watching us today, and we look forward to speaking to you all very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So
cheers,
if there
bye-bye.
is a question, thank you.